Hi, Al Franken here with another one of my Emmy Award-winning YouTube videos. Of course, this was only the third year that the National Academy of Television and YouTube Arts and Sciences has given out Emmys in the category of political commentary made expressly for YouTube. And I'd like to thank the Academy for recognizing my role in pioneering this exciting medium with 3 straight Emmys. What? I'm not allowed to show these? Okay, the Grammys, can I do that? No? Oh. Well, anyway, people seem to be enjoying these. Today I want to talk about an issue that I've touched on before, but that is still really bugging me. And I'm talking about the election laws that Republicans are passing in states around the country to suppress the votes of certain people. And who are those people? Well, they're the people who vote for Democrats, blacks and other people of color, also students, the poor, folks in urban areas, but mainly blacks and other people of color. Now, there is a piece of legislation, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that passed the House earlier this year and will come before the Senate soon. It's named for John Lewis, one of the demonstrators who got his head bashed in by cops in Alabama in March of 1965 when civil rights protesters tried to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, on their way to the state capitol in Montgomery to demonstrate for voting rights. Lewis got his skull split open by a police baton that day trying to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which is named for a Confederate general who also happened to become the Grand Wizard of the KKK and a United States Senator. Pretty impressive, huh? I mean, I was a senator and I won 3 Emmys. It's not nearly as impressive, I'll admit, okay? Now, the incident at the Edmund Pettus Bridge led directly to the 1965 Voting Rights Act being taken up and overwhelmingly passed later that year in Congress. The footage of Lewis getting his head bashed in was one of the images that got this monumental bill passed. Now, some Southerners claim that Lewis had just kept hitting the cop's nightstick with his head to win sympathy, but that's only if you run the footage in reverse. Later, Lewis became a member of Congress and made voting rights a major focus of his time there. And after Lewis died last year, the bill was renamed the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, of course, named for him. And he kind of deserved that. Now, what does the John Lewis Voting Rights Act do? Perhaps the single most important provision would restore something called preclearance. Now, what is preclearance? Well, it's really friggin' important. Preclearance was written into the original 1965 Voting Rights Act. Basically, preclearance applied to certain states and jurisdictions which had had a history of discriminating against people because of their race or color. States like, Mississippi or Alabama or South Carolina or Louisiana or Georgia or North Carolina or Virginia. What do those states have in common? They're all in the Confederacy. And just coincidentally, all had a history of denying people of color the right to vote. And how did they do that? Well, they got really creative. Take a state like Mississippi. They would routinely administer impossible literacy tests to black people. Now, I am 70, and I remember this stuff. There was a terrific black comedian, Godfrey Cambridge. Great comedian. I was a huge fan of Godfrey Cambridge because he was a satirist. And Godfrey Cambridge told this joke about a black guy trying to vote in Mississippi. And the poll worker stops the guy and says, son, you're going to have to take a literacy test. And the black guy says, okay. And the poll worker holds up a copy of the Gettysburg Address and says, now read this. And the guy says, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this okay, says the poll worker. He's a little frustrated. Now read this. And he holds up a copy of the Wall Street Journal. The black guy says, Dow Jones Industrials closed down 4 points today in mixed trading. Now the poll worker is really frustrated. He pulls out a newspaper, a Chinese newspaper. And he says, okay, boy, what does this say? And the black guy says, and Godfrey Cambridge said the N-word. It says, the N-word ain't voting in Mississippi this year. Now, I heard Godfrey Cambridge tell that joke when I was 13 years old, and I knew exactly what that meant, and I never forgot it. Sometimes a joke can have a way of sticking. The Congress that passed the Voting Rights Act knew full well that those states and jurisdictions were run by white men who did everything they could to suppress the votes of people whose skin was the color of Godfrey Cambridge. So, the 65 Voting Rights Act required all the covered states and jurisdictions to get rid of all their discriminatory practices, and from then on, to submit any new changes in their voting procedures, closing or moving polling places, changes in ID requirements, reduction in early voting days, purges to voting rolls. They had to submit those changes to the United States Department of Justice for preclearance. That's preclearance. Well, the Voting Rights Act worked really well, and Congress reauthorized it every few years with very one-sided votes in Congress. But then, in 2013, Shelby County, Alabama, just south of Birmingham, sued then Attorney General Eric Holder in federal court, arguing that parts of the Voting Rights Act were unconstitutional. The Supreme Court took the case, and in a 5-4 decision written by Chief Justice Roberts, the court ruled the act unconstitutional and ended preclearance for the states and counties. In his opinion, Roberts wrote that the blight of racial discrimination had been ameliorated and that preclearance was no longer needed. But Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's dissent was as powerful as it was prescient. That's what she wrote. Throwing out preclearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. A great quote has a way of sticking too. And of course, she was immediately proven right. Using Ginsburg's analogy, soon after the Roberts-Shelby County decision, suddenly blacks trying to vote in the South started getting very wet. Right after the High Court's ruling, the usual suspects, Texas, Alabama, and North Carolina, passed and implemented provisions clearly aimed at suppressing black votes. Within weeks of the Shelby decision, the North Carolina state legislature was able to pass and execute voter restriction laws to purge voter rolls. Instead of preclearance by the Justice Department, any objections to the obvious voter suppression had to work its way through the courts. So it wasn't until 3 years later that the Fourth Circuit Appellate Court ruled that the changes voted through by the North Carolina state legislature had, quote, targeted blacks with almost surgical precision. Many black North Carolinians didn't vote in North Carolina in 2014 because of those provisions. Republican Tom Tillis, who had led the effort in the state legislature to target black voters, narrowly defeated my Democratic colleague Kay Hagan for the U.S. Senate seat in the 2014 election. That seat was taken away from Kay and the Democrats because of John Roberts' Shelby County decision. It didn't take long for Republicans on the Hill to see that the Shelby County decision had worked in their favor. And in 2019, after a Democratic House passed a new Voting Rights Act that would restore preclearance, Mitch McConnell and the Senate refused to even hold a floor vote on the bill. Which brings me to Mitch McConnell, who said just this past week that there is no need to pass the John Lewis Act. Here's what he said.
It's against the law to discriminate in voting on the basis of race already, and so I think it's unnecessary.
Well, I'd say that was one of the stupidest things I've heard lately, but it's Mitch. So it's just cynical and dishonest. It's Mitch. Here's the thing. Discrimination in voting based on race has been illegal since 1870. You see, it's the 15th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any states on account of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. So it's been illegal in this country to deny or abridge people's right to vote on account of race since 1870. So what's all the fuss about? I guess there haven't been any problems in the last 151 years. Does this stuff drive you as crazy as it does me? He was standing before the press corps. One of them should have been able to say, "Are you kidding me? Why aren't my former Democratic colleagues going to the floor and saying, 'Are you kidding me?' And saying in the Judiciary Committee, 'Are you kidding me?' People fought hard and died for the right to vote. And we can't let Mitch McConnell get away so easy, rewriting history in such an obscene way." Well, I'm emotionally exhausted. I hope you'll keep watching and subscribe to my award-winning YouTube channel. Whew.